So let's talk about the entire history of the human population, shall we? Well, let's talk a little bit about it anyway. So we're going to be talking about the human population in general terms, basically what happens when we industrialize. But before we even talk about that, let's go back even further than that but before we were even agricultural. We were, for most of human history, hunters and gatherers, for most of human history. Then we had the onset of the agricultural revolution, that happened 10 to 12,000 years ago. And what that did was it actually increased our Earth's carrying capacity. We could now, besides just grow a lot of food, we learned to store food so we could make it, out past bad winters. But at the same time, we needed large families then to have farmers to work in the field. So large families made sense more when we became agricultural. So of course that's going to increase our population. Then we went through an industrial revolution, and this also had a major effect on the carrying capacity. Because we had the division of labor, we could produce so many more things, so our carrying capacity was increased again, Earth's carrying capacity. We had better farming techniques, our medicine was improved, a lot of things happened in the Industrial Revolution. And there are four important phases. That background diagram is the graph, population graph. There are four important phases that we need to understand when we go through this, what's called the demographic transition. That's the transition from a pre-industrial society, just the agricultural society, and a modern society. And so, my first question would be, when was the Industrial Revolution? Now, we have to not think about the Industrial Revolution as a date, because there are countries that went through Industrial Revolution very early, and that would be like the United States and Britain, and then countries that made it a little later, India and China. And then there are countries only going through their Industrial Revolution right now. So the Industrial Revolution is not a period of time. It's a transition you go through. And this graph seems to fit the human experience when you go through an Industrial Revolution. Okay? So at the before you're industrial, let's think about birth rates. We're going to keep track of birth rates. We're going to keep track of death rates. And we're going to keep track of total population. Now, there's a lot of different ways of calculating birth rates. They're reported often as how many births per 1,000 people in a population per year. Sometimes they're reported as a fertility rate. That's how many, on average, how many children a woman would have. It doesn't matter which one because these are going to be relative figures here. We're not going to use numbers. We can just say high or low. So before the Industrial Revolution, let's make a guess about the birth rate and the death rate. Do you think the birth rate was high or low? The death rate high or low? So it turns out that the birth rate and the death rate were both very high. We had a lot of people dying for lots of reasons. And so there were a lot of people being born because they had replaced the ones that were dying. And so the population was pretty stable, as you can see right there. So stable population. So what happens when you start your, so we have high birth and death rates, right? So what happens when you start your Industrial Revolution? What's going to happen to the birth rate? What's going to happen to the death rate when you first start your Industrial Revolution? So actually, when you first start the Industrial Revolution, the birth rate stays high and the death rate drops immediately. The birth rate stays high because the number of children you have, that's a decision that's really a cultural one. And it takes a long time for those things to change. Maybe a couple generations. If your parents came from a large family, the chances are that you will also have a large family. That's a tradition. So birth and death rates start high, but the birth rate stays high because of just cultural norms. But the death rate does drop because there's better living conditions. There's more medicine and things like that. So what's going to eventually happen, though, is, as you probably would guess, that about in the middle of your Industrial Revolution, the birth rate does start dropping. And this is the very important thing to remember from this little lecture, is that the birth rate starts to drop for some very predictable reasons. One is that you don't need the labor anymore. Kids aren't working on the farm. It's actually expensive to have children in a city. You have to buy them stuff and buy them food since you're not farming anymore. There's no added benefit to having a kid. One of the reasons that you had kids was you needed to have someone take care of you when you died or if you got injured. But in a city, we start building these social systems that take care of our old people and take care of our sick people. You don't necessarily need to have those children around to do that. And there's other really important things too. Women's education and women's status have a lot to play in that, and we're going to talk about that later. But the death rate also continues to drop because we got improved medicine and all those things keep on getting improved. So there's our three transitions. We have a fourth one, which is basically what we call our post-industrial revolution. And that's when the birth rate finally comes down to the death rate. And the population is still going up, though, because the birth rate stopped, all those kids who were born earlier are still having kids. And so those are being added to the population. We call that population momentum. But eventually, with the birth rate both low, the birth rate and the death rate low, that population is going to start stabilizing. Sometimes you can add even a fifth one, a fifth section. And this is where, the world has never been in this position before, post-industrial revolution for a long period of time. And what seems to be happening is that death rates are lowering, as we even get more healthy and take care of illness. But the birth rate drops pretty much dramatically still, continues to drop. We have birth rates very low in countries like Japan and Italy, actually even in the United States. So that's when the population might actually start declining. So here's another, so there you go. The population decreases as birth rates continue to drop. So I like this graph. It's got a lot of information on it, but what I really wanted to show on this is that green area. Because if you have high birth rates and high death rates, and then you have low birth rates and low death rates, your population is going to be stable. But it's that period of time when birth rates are much higher than the death rates. And while that's like that, that's that green area, that's where you get your population boom. And so by the time the population levels off after an industrial revolution, you're at a much bigger population. And then it needs to start coming down. And the coming down part, though, is something that we've never experienced, and that's causing its own problems. So that's the demographic transition. You really should be able to draw this graph from heart. It's a pretty simple graph to remember, I think.